Okay, you can rock and roll.
Okay, welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know, Pillar to Post, I've been doing this since 2006, and so we do home inspections. Pillar to Post, we're all over Utah. There's an office down in Cedar City that covers Cedar City, St. George. I cover most of central Utah. We go as far north as Manti, or South Manti, North Layton. There's another office in Salt Lake, another one in Park City, another one up northern Utah. So we've got the whole state covered, and that's probably one of the biggest advantages is we constantly are interacting with each other for help and to we see new things. Even me doing this and thousands of inspections, I'll still find stuff that I haven't seen before. So it's good to have that mind share. Today we're going to be doing a 1-hour core class on radon. Radon is, we'll learn a little bit about it. For those of you that have been in real estate for a while, you've probably noticed that radon is a lot more prevalent as far as the transaction and home buying process than it was 15, 20 years ago. And so we'll talk a little bit about why we see that now a lot more. We'll talk through a little bit about where it comes from and what you need to know about when it comes to radon. And if you have questions, just post them in the chat, and Tana can help me keep track of that. But otherwise, we will get going. I think if I can get my screen to work here. Okay, so when it comes to radon, we are going to talk a little about where it comes from, what it can do to your health, and why it is a health concern. We'll talk about the different levels that you can encounter with radon. You'll get your buyers will get a report, and it'll have a number, and what does that number mean? We'll talk about different ways of testing and things to be aware of, because there are some different protocols and different procedures when it's part of a real estate transaction versus just a homeowner wanting to test their house. And then we'll also talk about how we mitigate it or how we solve the problem. So moving on to what is radon. It is a radioactive gas that comes out of the ground. It is everywhere on our planet. So at any given time, you're probably breathing in some radon gas. In most cases, it's probably in small enough quantities that we're not too worried about it. It comes from uranium that's in the soil. There's trace amounts of uranium everywhere. Some scientists have speculated that if you were to take a dump truck worth of soil from anywhere on the planet, on average, you'd have about a half a teaspoon of uranium. Obviously, that's not going to be spread all over. In some places, it's higher concentration. That's where they mine uranium. There are several uranium mines in Utah. So Utah tends to be an area where we see a little bit more radon. In general, we'll look at some maps and things, but in general, the Rocky Mountains and most mountainous areas, you're going to usually find more radon than others. If you think back to junior high chemistry and physics, where you learn about radioactive elements and the periodic table, you have uranium. Let's see if I can. So uranium breaks down to radium, which breaks down to radon, which ultimately breaks down and becomes lead. And the main thing is that every time an element breaks down, it's giving off radiation. And so that's the real concern, is it's not so much that radon is dangerous, but radon breaks down and gives off radiation. So it's those radioactive particles that are a result of that breaking down of the elements. That's what we're breathing in. That's what's getting into our lungs. That's what's causing damage. I'm still trying to figure out this. Okay, clear. Okay. It is known as a human carcinogen, meaning it causes cancer. In fact, radon is the leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. So that's one thing where we hear a lot about it. Dr. Ackerley, he's one of the head scientists for lung oncologists up at the Huntsman. And that's kind of his story. I think he was in Massachusetts, and really kind of started looking at lung cancer. And he looked at, the Northeast of the United States, where they had a very high per capita of smokers. But then they looked at Utah, which has one of the lowest per capita or population of smokers, yet he still saw a significant amount of lung cancer in Utah. And that's what started him down the path. And so now he's a huge advocate as far as radon awareness. And that's where it's gotten a little bit more attention, is there are people that suffer lung cancer and they've never smoked before in their life, and a lot of it points back to radon. So there's our first keyword. So make sure to write that one down so you can submit it for credit later on. So what happens is radon is a gas, and that molecule is floating around, and as it breaks down, it gives off alpha particles, and those alpha particles get into our lungs, and they are radioactive, and they cause damage. Our skin is pretty resilient, so skin is not going to be hurt by alpha particles, but our lung tissue, that's where we start to see some damage over time, leads to lung cancer. You have, as I mentioned before, you have low levels of radon everywhere, and those lower levels are not a concern. It's in our homes is where we have more of a concern. So one of the things we're going to be talking about through the class is a lot of the myths and incorrect information that's out there. One of them that I've heard of before is, oh, it's a newer house, don't worry about it. It's a new house, you don't have to worry about radon. And it's actually the opposite is true, that if you live in an old drafty house, then radon is less of a concern because it tends to get into your house and then it gets out. One of the reasons that we see more of an awareness and more of a concern with radon in the last few decades is because starting in the 70s and 80s, we started making our homes more energy efficient. And so that energy efficiency makes our homes more tight, more sealed up. And so radon tends to accumulate more in our homes now. And so we're hearing more because we're seeing more, there's more awareness, there's more research going into it. But part of the reason is our homes do tend to be more of a problem than they were 30 or 40 years ago because of the energy efficiency that we're trying to do. So that's what we're looking at, is that buildup in our homes. And that's what we want to avoid some of the health concerns. This is more just kind of interesting, because one of the other myths or other things that I hear every once in a while is, well, there's really not a whole lot of evidence that small amounts of radon is bad, or even just small amounts of radon can actually be good for you. Now, where that rumor comes from is there are these spas or radium caves. So places where people will go, and they've been going for over 100 years, where they go to these places, they'd be in the spa for days or weeks as they had other health ailments, and they were cured. And so you might have heard that with certain hot springs have therapeutic effects, and these caves have therapeutic effects. A friend of mine was at a museum that had a big display on radiation and what we've learned about radiation over the years. And this was actually on display from the 30s. There was you've probably seen these bottles that will carbonate your drinks or give you carbonated water. You put a little cartridge in them that has carbon dioxide, and then it will carbonate your drink. Well, for a while, because of the popularity of these radium caves, they would actually sell these bulbs instead of carbon dioxide. They were actually filled with radon. And so you could carbonate your drinks with radon gas. And as it says, each bulb contains a fixed quantity of the essential radioactive element, which is the source of radon, so that the benefit of a radium emanation normally obtained by residents at a spa can now be conveniently and inexpensively procured without interference from your ordinary routine of daily life. So that was a thought almost 100 years ago, that small amounts of radiation could be health and a benefit. And you still hear that thought, that myth. I still hear that every once in a while from clients, from realtors, and that's not actually the case. It's kind of like a few years ago, my wife went through cancer treatments, and everything that we learned about with chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is a great drug. It solves a lot and kills a lot of cancers and helps people. Doesn't mean everybody should be on continual small doses of chemotherapy. So that's kind of the same thought with radon. Okay, so radon is measured in picocuries per liter. So a curie is a measurement. Madame Curie was one of the ones scientists that discovered how to measure radioactivity, and it's how much of that breakdown, how much radiation is given off per liter, and a pico is just a fraction of that. So it's just understanding that PCI/L, that's picocuries per liter. Average outdoor level is 0.3. You might have it higher, you might have it lower, but on average, that's kind of what you could expect in an outdoor environment. In an indoor environment, it's usually going to range between that 0.3 and up to 2.7, so an average of about 1.2. So as you can see, it does tend to build up into our homes just because we don't have that fresh air. So a lot of the questions is, how does it get into our homes? If we have our homes and they're so airtight, why are we having more of an issue? And it's coming out of the ground. So I actually just had this question. Well, we're buying a house that just had the question this week. We're buying a house that's on a slab. It doesn't have a basement, so radon shouldn't be as much of an issue. And my response was, well, radon comes out of the ground. If your house is on the ground, it is at risk for radon. Obviously, if the basement has a lot more surface area in contact with the ground, so a basement is more likely to have radon issues, but we still find a lot of homes on slabs without basements that tend to have radon issues. Along that same line, crawl spaces. Crawl spaces are kind of interesting because on the one hand, you have this huge open area, so anything coming out of the ground doesn't even have a slab that it has to try to go through. But a crawl space, so on the one hand, sometimes we find really high radon with a crawl space because it's such easy access. On the other hand, most crawl spaces are vented. So a lot of times that radon comes into the crawl space and then vents out. And so it's not getting up into the home. But really every home is susceptible to radon. And so you can't make those generalizations about basements. It's coming in through foundation cracks, cracks in the slab. If you have a sump pump or a sump pit, that's another opening. Other gaps around pipes, electrical conduit, all of those things are where it can come out through the ground. Now, one of the things that makes it come into the house a little bit more easily is we have something called the stack effect, and you've heard the term smokestack. Well, the stack is what warm air rises. And we all know that warm air rises. And in our home, it does as well. And as that warm air rises, it actually creates a lower pressure, or think of it like a suction or a vacuum in the lower levels of the home. So we actually do find or expect to find higher radon levels in, say, a townhouse or a home with 2 or 3 levels and a basement, because there's a lot more of a stack effect. It's, to kind of take that example, if you have a fireplace and a lot of that smoke tends to come back into the house, you can talk to a mason or a chimney sweep, and what they'll do is they'll extend the smokestack or your chimney and make it taller. A taller chimney creates more suction so that there's less of a chance of that smoke and coming back into the home. And so the same thing applies to a home. Is a 2 or 3 level home is going to have more stack effect than a rambler on a slab, for example. So as that warm air rises, you have a negative pressure in the lower levels, so a suction. So that actually is drawing the radon into a home. So normally warm air just rises, gases just rise. And so you think about a basement. So even though you might have radon in your front yard, around the house, it's not going to go straight up because it might get drawn into the basement. So even cracks along the walls and things like that may not be structurally a problem, are still an area where gases can get into the home. You have other things that are happening in your home that also cause a suction or a negative pressure. The most common one would be an exhaust fan in a bathroom that's sucking humidity and everything, all the air out of that bathroom and blowing it to the outside. So as it's sucking things out, it's creating a vacuum and it needs to make up that air. And so a lot of times that's pulling from a crawl space or from a basement. Same thing with the clothes dryer. If you have a central vac, if your range hood also vents to the outside. And the other one that we're seeing more of, because it's becoming more and more popular to put the HVAC system in the attic space, is you'll have air that sucks in to the furnace or the air conditioner and then blows back into the house. Well, if you have little gaps or leaks in the ductwork and it's not totally sealed, the amount being sucked into the system versus what's being pushed out can also be an imbalance and can cause that negative pressure. So there's lots of variables of what can cause that negative pressure in a home. And it really doesn't take much. It's not like we're going to see a huge suction and we're going to feel that pressure or anything. And how you can relate to that is barometric pressure. Barometric pressure changes with the weather. And so as a storm is coming in or going out, the barometric pressure changes. That barometric pressure, we see a direct correlation with storms and with radon in your home. So as pressure goes up or down, it puts more atmospheric pressure on the ground, which can allow that gas to come out or go in. So it's not like it takes a ton of pressure to allow those gases to get into our home. We've all seen unfinished basements. A crack in the slab is not something unusual, but even if you were to get a contractor that could give you a whole basement without any cracks, there still is a crack around the entire perimeter with just how basements are formed. They start by pouring the footing, then they'll pour the foundation wall, and then they'll pour the slab. So where that joint, where they all come together, is a perfect spot where all of that radon can come into the home. For those of you that work with rural properties on wells, radon is water soluble. It can be carried in the water, and it doesn't really become a gas until it gets aerosolized. And so, like as you're running a shower, that radon gases are then escaping or running the faucet. And so that is a scenario. There are tests that you can do for testing the water to see if there's radon in water, but just wanted to make sure that you're aware of a situation. Let's say you had a vacant house out on a piece of rural property on a well, and that vacant house, they do a radon test and it comes back low. And that just means that the radon that's in the ground is low and there's not a problem with it getting into the house. But then the people move in, they start using the well water and they're showering and they're bathing, they're doing dishes, all of those things, and they do another test and it comes back high. Well, that's the scenario where the radon in the well water can actually cause a problem. We don't see that very often. The testing is not as common. And most of those places where you are going to have rural properties. So we do a lot of tests down in Sanpete County. Sanpete County has a lot of radon in the ground anyway. So it's something that you're going to be dealing with in the ground or in the well water anyway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the levels of radon. We talked about the average indoor level is 1.2. That can range between 0.8 and 2.7. The number that we often are kind of looking for is 4.0, and that's the action level. And so again, another myth or another bad information is I'll hear people say, well, what's the legal limit? What's the required level? And there isn't one. especially here in the state of Utah, where there is no regulation on radon. The action level is what the EPA recommends action be taken when it is 4.0 or greater. But then the EPA also says remediation should be considered even when it's between 2 and 4. So I bring this up because on a number of cases I've heard, let's say we do a radon test and the result comes back at 3.8. And I'll hear the agent say, well, it's under 4, so we don't really have a leg to stand on to negotiate it. Anything's negotiable. And so just like, trying to negotiate a roof or a furnace or anything like that, this should be considered the same. And we'll talk about some of the risks and things. And depending on a person's background, for some people, a 2 picocurie reading might be more hazardous than for someone else that has a 6 picocurie reading. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Another myth or bad information that I've heard is the EPA and the US are very strict and very conservative, and many other countries, their radon levels are much higher, and their acceptable limits are way higher. This was true when I started doing inspections 15 years ago. There at that time, Canada, they used a different system. They didn't use picocuries. They use another system called becquerels. It's kind of like inches and centimeters. But their basically equivalent was about 30 picocuries was their action level. And so that caused a lot of issues, especially when I was starting to do radon testing, that, well, yeah, but 4 is really extreme. Well, it was about 15 years ago, Canada changed their recommendation and their level is now around 5 picocuries. So it's not really an argument anymore. And to further that, about 10 years ago, the World Health Organization conducted a large study that spanned over several decades. And they came out with new recommendations. And at least for the World Health Organization, their action level is now 2.7. So we are actually quite liberal on our action level compared to much of the rest of the civilized world. And where a lot of this comes into is in the last 20 years, our understanding of the synergies and the risks associated between people that have smoked and people that have never smoked. And what they're finding is that there's a huge correlation. That even if you aren't currently smoking, if you've ever smoked and then you're exposed to radon for an extended period of time, that your chance of lung cancer is exponentially higher than someone who has never smoked. So here are some tables and some data that the EPA put together. Just like any other cancer or health issue, everyone's immune system, everyone's body is a little bit different. And so you've all probably heard of people that, my grandma smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day and she lived till she was 95. And then you hear other stories of, he started smoking in high school and he died of lung cancer when he was in his 40s. So there's exceptions to all these things, but to give us some guidelines, this is what the EPA put together based on the data that they've collected over the years, that if 1,000 people who had smoked before in their life were exposed to these levels of radon, this is going to be their risk that they get lung cancer. And just for those of you who are aware, lung cancer is pretty much a death sentence. There's not too many people that survive lung cancer. Most lung cancer, if treated, can extend your life, but it's pretty much a death sentence with lung cancer. So basically saying 1,000 people living in at the 4 picocuries, about 62 out of those 1,000 would get lung cancer and die, and then they try to put that into a perspective that we can relate to. That's 5 times the risk of dying in a car crash. Now, if you were to compare that to people who have never smoked, it's 1/5 the risk. So for someone that's never smoked, it's the risk of dying in a car crash. But for someone who's smoked, that risk now goes up 5 times. And so where, as you're working with clients, if clients feel, you know what, I want to get it down closer to 2, we don't know their history, we don't know their susceptibility to cancers based on their family, their hereditary history. So that's why I bring this up, is even though 4 is the action level, between 2 and 4 is still highly recommended. Just to give you some other, we find levels of 10 quite frequently. Just to give you some examples, 10s, even 20s. The highest one I found was in Saratoga Springs, and that was 140. I've had some in Cedar Hills that were in the 80s. I've had some in Provo that were in the 50s. So the ranges are all over, but even at 10, that's 20 times the risk of dying from lung cancer compared to dying in a home fire. And when you put that in perspective of, how many people, they're pretty adamant about having a good smoke detector in their house, yet they've never tested for radon when they could live in one of those areas where 10 is not unheard of. So it is something to be aware of. We'll talk a little bit more about the testing and some of the risks there in just a minute. And I think this is our next key word, number 2. Okay. So, okay, we talked a little about the risks. So, when it comes to radon levels and where to expect levels and things like that, that's another topic that we see a lot of speculation. A lot of it comes from back about 30 years ago. The EPA put together these radon zone maps. And what they did is they took the data they had available and they applied it to each county across the country. And then they gave it a score based on the likelihood that there's going to be radon, or the average radon levels. And so zone 1 meant that, you have a pretty high, risk that you're going to find radon. Zone 2, most of the homes are going to be between 2 and 4. And then zone 3 meant that your risk was pretty low. So if you look at Utah, that was the data that was around when I started doing radon tests. That's where they, we're kind of just at a medium, moderate risk, not too bad. Let's not worry too much about it. The problem was when these maps and this data was put together, there wasn't a whole lot of information for Utah. And so a lot of it was just a guess. So about 10 years ago, the state health department, they took the data that they had available and applied the same rules to see how things had changed. And that data, whenever anyone does a lot of these home test kits, that data goes to just a few labs across the country. And depending on, most of those labs have relationships with all the different health departments across the country. And what they'll do is they'll aggregate all of their results and give them back to the state. So all of those tests, which are now tens of thousands of tests that have been done in the state of Utah over the last several decades, those have all been aggregated, and you can actually go and look in those results. If you go to radon.utah.gov, there is a link on that page. They've changed the website a few different times, but if you look on that website, that's the state's radon resource website. But look for radon by zip code. And they'll actually have a big spreadsheet that you can find all of the different zip codes in the state. It'll tell you how many tests have been performed with that zip code, what the highest level ever recorded was in that zip code, and then the average, and gives you all that information. So they have very reliable data, and this is what the state of Utah should look like for the EPA radon maps. The one thing that the state did different is if we have less than 50 tests, then they left it gray. They didn't just fill it in with a color that was kind of adjacent, which is kind of what the EPA did. So you can see that most of the areas that that we're working in is in the north half of the state. They're going to have a higher likelihood for radon. In fact, the data shows that 1 in 3 homes are on average in Utah are going to be high on radon. And that's also Salt Lake and Utah counties. That's also what the numbers are, is 1 in 3. Sanpete County is probably closer to 1 in 2. You know, we get a little bit more as you get into Summit County, Wasatch County. Again, those more mountainous regions, and then especially as you get back into eastern Utah, you're going to find radon is a lot more prevalent than just 1 in 3. Another just study that was done about 30 years ago is the Utah Geological Society. They put together a map, and where this map was based on actual data that was collected for radon results, they put a map together that was based on the geological propensity for radon. So it was kind of a forecasting. And it does get a lot more detailed than just county by county. And you can search for that Utah Geological Survey radon map. And it's a huge PDF that you can zoom in. But as you can see, so just get my tool out here. Here's Utah Lake. And I mean, pretty much there's Utah County, but you can see and this is what we see pretty much all along the bench. We do see a lot of radon. We see a lot of radon that comes out of Provo Canyon all the way over to the lake. This is around Saratoga, where we see a lot of springs. As you get over like into the ranches, Eagle Mountain, we see a lot of radon. So it is fairly accurate with what my experience has been in those areas. And just if I really had to generalize, and as one of my colleagues once put it, radon tends to follow the wealthy. So the higher bench neighborhoods, those usually have higher radon. And then the other area where we usually find radon is in some of the river bottoms. So like the neighborhoods at the mouth of Hobble Creek Canyon, it's rare that we don't find radon. Same thing with the river bottoms in Provo Canyon. It's rare that we don't find radon in those homes. Okay. So radon testing. The good news is that tests are inexpensive. They're easy to do. They're readily available for even homeowners. And even the homeowner kits are going to be fairly reliable for a lot of testing. Originally, the tests were because you wanted to know long-term averages, and radon levels can change a lot season to season, when the ground is snow covered, when it's frozen, when it's wet, when it's dry, when barometric pressure is high, when barometric pressure is low. And so a longer test is what was originally prescribed. But obviously in the real estate community, 90-day due diligence just wasn't going to cut it. And so they came up with a short-term test, which is more of a screening, but they've been doing it now for 40 or 50 years. And it's fairly reliable in predicting and estimating if you're going to have a radon problem or not in a home. You have some different types of tests, and so we'll go through those here. An electret. You're probably only going to see this. They aren't very popular, but this is a professional type test. It has a little kit, little canister like this that the technician will set up. Usually he'll set up 2 of them if it's part of a real estate transaction, so they can get an average of the 2 different results. But I'm only aware of 1 or 2 companies in the state that are using those. This is called an alpha track. This is a long-term test. This is probably the best test that you could do for your home. It's a minimum of 91 days up to 12 months. And so for clients that are concerned and they're not worried about the timeliness, like trying to get it done in a transaction, this is usually what I recommend. They're usually run about $40 to $60 for this test. And you set it up in your home, and then you set it up in your home, you record the date and time, you let it run. I usually tell people, try to let it run at least 8 months. So you're going through several different seasons, and then seal it back up, you mail it back to the lab, and then you get the results. And that's going to be most accurate for what your home is doing as far as radon with your living conditions. Like we talked about the different things, if you do that short-term test, and a short-term test is usually just around 48 to 60 hours, and maybe that was laundry day, you were running the dryer a bunch, or maybe the barometric pressure was lower than usual. And, so there's a lot more variables, where this one is going to cut out all those variables and just give you what your average exposure is. This is your more common short-term DIY test kit. They have a charcoal substance inside of them, and charcoal is like a sponge. It absorbs all the chemicals and particles and molecules out of the air. So same type of thing, you open it up, this one has like a little clock, so you can record the date and then the exact time when you open it up, and then the exact time when you seal it back up and you send it off to the lab. These kits run about $15 a piece. They're fairly reliable as long as you get them from a reliable source. I usually tell people, try to avoid the big box stores, because these are more susceptible to how they're stored and their shelf life. So all of these tests that I'm talking about, these at home or do it yourself, can be purchased off of the state's website, radon.utah.gov. And so you can purchase that. The other place where I've often seen where homeowners can get these tests are at the Habitat for Humanity restores. A lot of times they'll have them stocked. And you're going to hear a lot more. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but January is Radon Awareness Month. Nationwide, January, Radon Awareness Month. So you'll start seeing a lot more of those places advertising and promoting testing your home. The EPA does recommend every home be tested every 2 years. Because things can change, whether it's geology, landscaping, just different variables, and testing your home every 2 years is recommended. So again, back to these tests, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of just compare and contrast some of them. This is a continuous monitor, and there's a few variations of this. This is more of your professional tests and more of what your professionals will be using in a real estate transaction. These are an electronic device, and in most cases, they'll wake up once an hour and take a snapshot of what the radon results are at that time. And then you can have a very accurate report of what radon is doing throughout the test period. So as far as pros and cons between a professional test and one of these do it yourself is you're going to have hour by hour readings. So you're going to know what's going on, and radon will go up and down, and we'll look at a few charts here in a minute. It goes up and down and all over the place. But with one of these kits, you're just going to get a final result. The other thing to be aware of is that radon has a very short half-life. It's about 2.5 days. So radon starts to break down after 2.5 days. That's why we can get a 2-day test and get fairly accurate results. But what that means is if you don't time this correctly, usually these kits run for 72 hours. So you do them for 72 hours, you stick them in the mail, they take a couple days to get to the lab, and then they get processed. Well, if there's a weekend, especially a holiday weekend in between when they process it and when you send it off, that extra time, the radon is breaking down. And so it's not a true average, but it's what they call, it's biased towards the end. So whatever the results were towards the end of the test are going to weigh a little bit more as far as the final results. And you'll see how important that is when we look at the results, and you can have drastic swings from hour to hour. So what I usually tell people is the advantages of this kind of test is they're cheap, $10, $20. The disadvantage is it's not as accurate, but it's a good test. So I usually tell people if it comes in less than 2, you're probably fine. If it comes in over 5, you most likely have a problem. When it's in that 2 to 5 range, is it below or above 4, especially with real estate? It's a little less reliable. At a minimum, I tell people for the cost, just get 2 of them and do it side by side so you can at least have a little bit more information. Pros and cons of this one: the main disadvantage is just the cost. Most professionals are going to charge between $100 to $200 to do a test at a home, but you do have more immediate information. Where these ones you have to usually run for 72 hours, send it off to the lab, wait for the results. This test usually can run for 48 hours and then you can have the results immediately. These are the type, and I'll just kind of a little bit of a soapbox as far as professionalism in my industry. These are professional continuous monitors. So in your listings with your clients, this is the type of device that you should see if they're paying for a professional test. I bring it up because over the last decade, a lot of companies have come out with electronic testing devices, but they're designed for the homeowner. And unfortunately, there's a lot in my industry, since it's not regulated in Utah, where I do see home inspectors using these types of kits or these types of devices as a radon test. The EPA and multiple organizations have dictated what a professional test and what tests should be used, especially in real estate transactions. So this is one company, Corientium. This middle gray one, I actually have one of those in my house. It's great to just, if you don't have a radon system and you just want to keep tabs on things, I think they were like $90 around Black Friday. They're usually around $130. They have a new one called the Wave, where it will send it to your smartphone and track it. But it's nice. I have one in my basement and I can kind of look, okay, long-term average, short-term average. I see it. It'll get up to 5 or 6, but overall, for the last 2 years that I've had it in my house, I'm at about 1.8. And so, okay, I know I'm good. So it's kind of a good homeowner. Where these are in the $100 to $150 range for a homeowner, a professional one like this yellow one at the bottom, those ones run about $1,500 to $1,800. So you can see why, you know, why some inspectors may not want to invest in some of that. This is a Pro Series Siren 3. They're one of the first ones out. Same
Hey,
type
Jared.
of thing. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we have a question.
Yes.
Can you read it, or do you want me to read it to you?
Oh, let me just pull it up. Let's see here. If charcoal is a sponge for radon, would it be helpful to put charcoal in the basement to attract it so it's in the air less? You would need quite a significant amount of it. That is, if you have a good, a lot of room purifiers or air filters are actually charcoal based, and that can help pull chemicals out of the air. But it's probably not, I haven't come across anything saying that that is a viable or reliable way of treating radon. So in theory, it could work, but I think it's not very feasible. And I haven't come across anything. I do know that charcoal is used for other chemical contaminants. But it is also one of those things where, sorry, I'm just kind of thinking out loud too. I think the other issue is that even though it's a sponge and it's sucking it in, that radon element is still breaking down. It's still giving off the alpha particles. So it's not disposing of them. So I mean, I'm taking back what I initially said. I don't know that it would be that helpful, because it wouldn't really get rid of the radon out of your house. In fact, it would just kind of concentrate it in one area. So hopefully that helps. Sorry, I'll try to watch those chats for more questions. So I just want to point this out because I have had a few clients, and again, I know all of you are professionals. That's why you're trying to get CE. And so you expect people that you're working with and your clients are hiring to also be professional. And I just don't think it's fair and ethical if there are inspection companies that go and buy $130 device to go and charge $100 to a client with a device that, you know, I mean, even from the manufacturer, you know, this one says it should not take the place of a professional test. The other one basically says that, they're not recommended for home inspections. Part of the reason is, let's see, these two white ones, those are real common ones. My company uses, we have some of these ones and some of these ones. These are all very reliable, but these systems all cost anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a piece. And the other thing that a professional device is required by most regulations is that you have to send it off to a lab and have it calibrated every year. And so it gets quite expensive. And a lot of those other home devices aren't really rated, and you can't really get them calibrated. Calibration costs me about $300 per device per year. So there's a lot of ongoing costs when it comes to professional testing. So I just say that, make sure that if your clients are hiring someone to give a professional test, make sure they're doing it to professional standards. This one of the agents that I work with a lot, she was on the selling side. The buyers hired an inspector to do a radon test. And this is what the buyers sent and said, hey, we want you to take care of a radon. We want to negotiate radon mitigation. Here's the test results. So basically, the inspector used a home DIY device, threw his business card over it, and that was the report. And it's just not, it can be done much more professionally. The other thing, well, there's your third keyword. The other thing I taught this class a few weeks later. One thing that you're seeing a lot is a lot of radon mitigation companies have come into the market in the last decade. And a lot of them, part of their marketing strategy is to go out and offer free radon testing. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's a way for them to get their foot in the door and be recommended. Make sure your clients, if they are going this route, make sure it's a reputable company. Not all of them are, and not all of them are really have the client's interests in mind. So I taught this class a few weeks later. I had an agent call me and say, hey, I went to your radon class, and I remember we talked about testing standards, and the buyers just did a test at my listing, and they took one of those little charcoal kits and threw it down next to the water heater in the mechanical room. So there's a lot of problems with that. One, if it's a real estate transaction and it's one of those types of devices, it has to be two devices done together or simultaneously or in sequence, but two tests. They should never be done in a mechanical room. It should always be in a normal living space, and it should always be at least 20 inches off the floor. So it was not done to any professional standard. And so again, help protect your clients. A professional test should give you some results like this, where you can see hour by hour and what's going on throughout the testing period. These red dots that you're seeing here, most professional systems have some sort of tamper detection, and so those are motion sensors. So if we saw really high results and then a tamper, and then really low results and then a tamper and then really high results, we would suspect that they threw a blanket over the monitor, or they picked it up and set it outside and then they brought it back in. I have seen that a couple times in my career, thankfully only a couple times. But it is one of those things, again, that people are paying for a professional test. They expect professional results. Okay, we're going to keep moving through here. For test results, here's one that I just to emphasize how weather can make such a big impact. This was right after it was in late March or early March, heavy snowstorm. Lots of wet, heavy snow, storm. When barometric pressure goes up, radon goes down. So barometric pressure was really low. And then as the barometric pressure started going up, radon started to drop. Plus the ground was really wet. So if your yard is super wet and saturated or frozen with snow, the gas can't come out, so it's going to tend to go into your basement more. And so having these unusual results is not uncommon. I want to emphasize that with real estate transactions, there are variables. And so I've had cases where it came back at, 4.8, and the seller said, well, we're going to do our own test, and they do a test and comes back at 3.8. Well, who's right? Well, they both are. If you look at this one was done for more than 48 hours, which is all that's required. And had we done it in the first 48 hours, it would have been well over 4. The actual result was 4 for this whole period. However, if we've done it in the last 48 hours, it would have been well under 4. So which one's right? They all are. That's why a long-term test really is the best result. The short term is just kind of a screening to give us an idea of where we stand. But that's why having these results and knowing what's going on can also help us make some judgment calls. There's another one where you can see where it's all over the place. Okay, so it's just some other things that happen with a short-term test. Closed house conditions are required. So what that means is we want to try to eliminate as many variables as possible. And so all doors and windows need to stay closed except for normal entry and exit. So if it's summertime, and so let's say we get called out to do an inspection, it's the middle of July, and they only have a swamp cooler or window air conditioner units, we often will not do the test unless we can be convinced that the seller is going to not operate any of those, because you can't operate anything that's bringing in fresh air from the outside, because that will invalidate the test. So this time of year, it's easy. Everything is already staying closed up as it is. Spring and fall makes it harder because a lot of people like to open up their windows when it gets cool in the evening. That can't be done during a radon test. Another reason why that graph makes sense, because we can see, wow, it dropped at night, then it went back up during the day, then it dropped at night. And that can tell us whether it was actually they adhered to these requirements. We don't do it in kitchens or bathrooms. It needs to be 20 inches off the floor. It needs to be away from drafts. So that monitor shouldn't be placed like under or above a heat register, because every time that furnace kicks on or the air conditioner kicks on, it's blowing a lot more air over the device, and it's not giving you an accurate picture of just the normal air in the house. It's again an invalid test. And not in the utility room. So that was the one that stuck out with that one agent. He's like, hey, didn't you say it shouldn't be done in the utility room? Well, yeah, they put it next to the water heater. So we will try to look for evidence of tampering or indications that, I've had a couple cases where we were really worried about it, and we actually went and taped all the windows closed and made sure, when we came back that things hadn't been, because we had multiple tests that we had to keep going. And so there are cases like that. Luckily, we don't have to deal with that too much. So this is other thing to remember is that when you have a non-real estate test versus a test done during a real estate transaction, the protocols are a little bit different. And part of that is for a normal homeowner, if they're doing a test, the recommendation is if you do a short-term test, it's between 4 and 10, then you need to confirm that with a long-term test. If you do a short-term test and it's over 10, do another short-term test to confirm it. With a real estate transaction, it's much simpler. If you do a valid short-term test and it's over 4, remediation is recommended. So I get that question a lot. Well, what if it's 4.1? Are you going to tell my clients that they should get a system? Yes, I'm going to follow the EPA recommendation. If it's 4.0 or greater, I'm going to say remediation is recommended. Well, what if it's 3.9? Well, I'm going to also say what the EPA recommends. Action is recommended after 4.0, but is also recommended between 2 and 4. And then you can find that right on the EPA's website regarding radon. Okay, there's your keyword number 4. We're going to try to get through this last little bit. We just have a few more minutes. So how do we clean it up? The good news is radon remediation is very reliable. It's not that expensive. I should probably update this. Average cost is probably closer to about $1,500 right now. Where that variability of cost is if you have a crawl space. If you have a crawl space, then you should plan on probably closer to $2,000 to $2,500. There's just a lot more work to seal up that crawl space compared to sealing up a basement or a slab. Other costs that could be involved if you have a split level house, you have to treat both sections of the foundation. The one that's lower, usually like a split level, will have a basement and a crawl space, or a slab and a basement, or a half basement and a full basement, and they have to treat those two areas a little bit different. So there's some added cost there as well. Basically, what you're doing to treat for radon is you want to provide an alternate path for the radon so it's not coming into the house. So here is probably the most simple way of looking at it. They're going to cut a hole in the slab, and they're going to dig a little bit of dirt out from underneath the slab and make a little air pocket. And they're going to put a pipe down into the ground and run that pipe so it extends up above the roof. And then they'll install a fan in line, and that fan is going to be sucking 24/7. And so radon will get drawn into the fan and vented out of the house. It's creating a negative pressure. So the technical term for a radon mitigation system is a sub-slab depressurization system, because it's depressurizing or causing a negative pressure under the slab and venting it out. Now, if you get a radon system installed as part of your construction, they might install the pipe work, but not a fan, because there is no way to test a home prior to it being completed. So a lot of builders will just install the passive system, is what it's called, when it doesn't have the fan. And then they'll test, and if it's high, then they'll put in the fan. A passive system will usually solve about 50 to 70% of radon issues. An active system with a fan usually solves 95% of radon issues. Okay, so passive versus active. If you have an existing home, very few remediators are going to install a passive system. It's just not worth the time and effort. They're going to come out and they're going to put the fan in, because then they're more confident that that's going to work. With an active system, you do have an ongoing cost with electricity, because that fan is running 24/7, 365. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is the state, radon.utah.gov, has a list of EPA or industry certified radon mitigators. So I'd recommend always using one of them. And then the other thing is that I see a lot during transactions is not all radon systems are equal. There are fairly similar, there's fairly similar standards, but they're not all equal. In fact, we did a home recently, new construction, and the clients were sold that it had a radon system. When we were doing the inspection, we asked about it, had kind of a ventilation system in the crawl space, and we talked to the client, to the builder happened to come by, and we asked, hey, what's with, oh, it's just a special ventilation system. But they were sold that it was a radon system, and it probably helps with radon, but there are specific requirements of how a radon system should be done properly. So making sure that is the case. And then the other thing too is there's different quality in the pipe. So a thinner pipe is going to be more noisy. The fan quality is going to have a shorter or longer lifespan. It's going to be more energy efficient. And so as realtors, as you are negotiating, just saying, hey, we want the radon system installed, it might be worth your clients, being able to have some say in what is being installed and how it's being installed. As an example, I inspected a house that had a beautiful view up on Suncrest. So beautiful view of the whole valley. Except when you're out on the back patio, all you could hear was the radon fan, because they'd installed it right there on the back. That is kind of the preferred. Well, more people are starting to install along the exterior of the home, because it's a lot less damaging. They don't have to cut into walls. They can just go from the basement, go outside, and then go up the side of the house. But ideally, if you can run it through the walls, through the chimney chase, put the fan up in the attic, then you don't hear it, and it's not noisy. And think of your bathroom exhaust fan. That's kind of what a radon fan sounds like. So if you want that off your back porch, that might be the difference of one company that quotes you $1,200 and another company that quotes you $1,500, to make sure that it's actually done and looks the way and results the way that you want. Again, radon.utah.gov, there is a radon hotline. I don't know if, I think Andrea changed positions, but there is another radon coordinator at Utah County that you can always call and ask for more information. The main thing is make sure that radon shouldn't be a stigmatized item. It shouldn't be something that should worry people. I had a client or a friend of mine that was buying a house, asked me to come do the inspection. She calls me the next day and says, we might need to hold off. We have this other house we're looking at because that one that we really wanted, we found out it had a radon system. And this was 10 years ago. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. That's kind of the analogy is, it's kind of like going and looking at two cars. And you have car A, looks great, has 10 airbags, for safety. And car B only has 5 airbags. Well, let's get the car B because it has less airbags. That must mean that it's safer and it doesn't get in as many crashes. That's kind of the mentality. Buying a house that has a radon system should be a plus, because you know that every home that doesn't have a radon system has a 1 in 3 chance of needing one. So make sure you're emphasizing it. That is a selling point. More and more people are becoming aware of radon, and having that system shouldn't be something that, you'd be surprised how many times after the inspection we say, oh, you have a radon system, and the client says, oh, I do. And that really should be something that, it's a $15,000 to $2,000 upgrade that they're not going to have to worry about. So I think we are about out of out of time. Are there any other concerns or questions that any of you have for me? It's always a little bit different experience doing this just online and not being able to walk around and move around.
That's wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Make sure you submit those keywords. Oh, there was one more keyword. There's your last one. And get those submitted, and then we will get those banked within the next week.
Someone's asking for the hotline number again, please.
But if you go to that website, radon.utah.gov, it's a great resource. You can order test kits from there. You can see the radon maps, all kinds of information about radon in Utah is on that website. Well, thank you, everyone, and reach out to me if you have questions, and look forward to doing this again.